Hello, and welcome to another episode of Leaders of Transformation. Today, we're going to talk with Ken Falke, who is a 21-year combat veteran in the U.S. Navy Explosive Ordnance Disposal community, and he is a retired Master Chief Petty Officer. He is highly respected around the world as an innovative and forward thinker on the subjects of wounded warrior care, military and veteran transition, counterterrorism, military training, and innovative technology development. He is the chairman and founder of Boulder Crest, which is an organization focused on the teachings of post-traumatic growth, and the EOD Warrior Foundation. He spends a lot of his time educating the public and private sectors on issues surrounding the long-term care of our returning military personnel and their families. And he is the co-author of an excellent book, highly recommended. I loved this book. It's called Struggle Well, and he wrote it with Josh Goldberg, so the two of them. And there's actually a foreword for the book by Captain Charlie Plumb, which was interesting because I heard Charlie Plumb speak probably 20, 25 years ago. And he was a POW for quite a long time and in Vietnam, and it's just a powerful story. And so that really caught my attention when I heard about Ken, which actually brings up one more thing before we get into the interview. Is Christy Hughes from Smith Publicity is the one that connected us. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Smith Publicity. I always like to acknowledge those that help make this show a great success. So thank you to Christy and Ken. Welcome. We're glad you're here today.
Oh, thanks, Nicole. Good to see you.
Good to see you. And let's talk a little bit. I mean, I gave them a quick overview on you, but there's so much to what you're doing and so much behind it in terms of your passion. So maybe just bring us up to speed. Tell us a little bit more about yourself. How did you get into this work? Counterterrorism, hello, how'd you get into that? And, the whole minefield experience, and then how you became passionate about this specific work.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I spent 21 years in the Navy, and I was a bomb disposal guy. I think probably in the military, we call it EOD, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, as you mentioned, but I just say bomb disposal. And I spent the first portion of my career doing kind of traditional bomb disposal work, which in the Navy is primarily underwater. And then I started my second half of my career supporting special forces missions. So our job as bomb disposal guys were to get special forces teams, Navy SEAL teams, into places that were mined and booby trapped. And that was my job. And I became pretty good at my job. My expertise became weapons of mass destruction, specifically things like improvised chemical and biological and nuclear bombs. And when I retired from the Navy, I was in San Diego, and I had this idea that in the United States, bombs that end up in our cities in the United States are responded to by the police departments. And prior to 9/11, the police departments didn't get a lot of extra training and equipment for this mission. So let's just say, for argument's sake, an improvised chemical weapon ended up in downtown Los Angeles. Back in 1999, you would have been waiting on a bomb squad that their expertise was maybe, LA is probably not a great example because they were always on the front edge of things, but a bomb squad that really hadn't seen that level of sophistication. So I had an idea to start a company that would go around the United States and train bomb disposal personnel on more sophisticated threats. And then 9/11 happened, and everybody wanted what we were doing. And then bombs started going off in Iraq, and everybody wanted more of what we were doing. So our company really grew from me in my garage in March of 2002 to almost 500 employees when we sold the company, and I left it in 2010. So that's kind of how I got into the counterterrorism business. We were mostly teaching SWAT teams and bomb squads and dive teams how to respond to terrorist events in the United States and abroad. We did a lot of training overseas as well. not specifically for our military, but for foreign governments through the State Department. And then we also did a lot of training for our military who was deploying overseas. So I sold the company in 2010, and then really this kind of philanthropic work that I do now is really what took over. But how that started was all the way back in 2004. The first EOD troop, a soldier, lost his legs in Iraq to a bomb. And one of my best friends was his sergeant major, and he called me from Iraq and asked me if I would meet the kid. And I hate to say kid because he was a soldier, he's an adult, but meet this young man and his family at the hospital here in Washington, D.C., which is about an hour from where I live. And I told him I'd be honored to do it. And I ended up getting to the hospital, and there was this poor young man laying there with no legs and no parents or anybody around. So after, a little bit of interrogation, I found out that, the only parent he had was his mother. He had no siblings. His father was out of the picture. And his mom didn't have any money. So I paid for his mom to fly. Well, I paid for his mom to do two things. One was get care for her dog, which, interestingly enough, she seemed to be more worried about at the time than her son. But it was just, I think all the emotion and stress was bothering her so much. But we paid to get her dog into a kennel, and then paid for her to fly to Washington, D.C. and be bedside with her son. Now, as a guy who spent 21 years in this community, and although there were a couple people that were severely injured and killed when I was on active duty, I had never seen anybody lose both legs. And I think what I was hoping for was, like most Americans, was that this was going to be a 3 or 4 month war like the first Gulf War, and it would all be over, and this would be the first and the last guy that I saw that way. But the truth was I did that 11 more times that year. And the government, strangely enough, was not paying for families to travel to the hospital to be with their loved ones. And I found that just kind of completely appalling. So we were lucky. My company was making a lot of money. My wife and I had some money. We were able to do this without, taking a financial impact on our own, well-being. And then as we started doing it more and more and more, we realized we should probably start a foundation. If this war is going to go on for a long time, we should probably start a foundation to help these people, and then we can raise money from the public as well. And that's what we did. In 2007, we started something called the Wounded EOD Warrior Foundation. That foundation is still around. I'm not associated with it anymore, but just because my term off the board is done. But it's called the EOD Warrior Foundation. We dropped the word wounded for a couple of reasons. One is it was really indicative of people with physical wounds, and what we're dealing with today primarily are these invisible injuries, and a lot of people with invisible injuries don't consider themselves wounded. So we dropped the word wounded in 2013, set up some board terms, and I termed off out of that organization. And then where I'm at today, in 2010, when we sold the company, my wife and I lived on a 200-acre estate. And we started bringing the families of these wounded guys out to our home. And that's what really inspired us. We donated 37 acres of our land. We put up $1 million and went out and raised another $9 million to build the nation's first privately funded retreat center for combat veterans and their families. And that's called Boulder Crest. And it's a separate nonprofit, a separate foundation. And I'm the chairman of the board of that foundation. That's my primary job today, is overseeing the work at Boulder Crest.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing. And yeah, you must have seen so much over the years that, so what I loved about your book is when you talk about struggle well, is that a lot of times, even and this is for veterans, they have a lot of experience with trauma, but even in regular society, we deal with a lot of stuff, and a lot of times I find that people don't feel like they should have to deal with a lot of stuff, or that it's a bad thing. And in your book, you really emphasize the gift in the midst of struggle, and how can you struggle well so that you don't end up with PTSD and stuck in a pattern of pain and suffering, and even perpetual re-traumatizing yourself and moving to this place of post-traumatic growth. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that. What is post-traumatic growth? What is even like maybe weaving into that? What is some of the problems? What are some of the problems that most PTSD therapy has, that is, and training, that it's just because it's not working the way that it's designed to work?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. Let me start by saying this: is that the mental health system in our country is broken. We, thanks to pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies, we have medicalized, if you will, life. Right? I mean, all of us, as you mentioned, all of us have trauma. It doesn't matter, do people that go to war see more horrible things than people that don't? Maybe, probably. But I mean, there's some firefighters and EMTs that are on the street every day seeing dead bodies in cars, and that trauma leaves a mark on you. I had a friend of mine who was a big wig up on Wall Street, and she was in a taxi in New York, and the taxi got T-boned, and the driver lost his head in the headlight in the back seat with her for 30 minutes while these firefighters cut her out of the car. That left a mark on her, right? She wasn't a combat veteran. She wasn't in Iraq or Afghanistan. So I think, veterans don't have the monopoly, if you will, on trauma. I mean, it is normal. And that's what we were trying to write in this book about, is that, we get asked a lot with the work that we do with veterans, which is very productive work for civilians. And that's why we wrote this book. We do regret sometimes the cover. The cover looks very manly and very military, but the book was written for the average person who's suffering with trauma. And we've had a lot of great feedback from people. So here's our belief. First and foremost, our belief is simply this: no matter who we are in life, your life lives this series of ups and downs. We call it a sine wave. But it's a series of ups and downs. You can almost map your life out, right? You're born, you have an experience as a child, you graduate high school, maybe you go to college, you get your first job, you meet your first girl, you get married, you get divorced, this kind of life. You buy new cars, the cars get wrecked, you have kids, your kids wreck your cars. I'm kind of talking about my life, right? It's like, and at some point in time, it ends, right? We all finish at some point in time. We all die. And that sine wave is finite. We know that our lives are going to live a series of ups and downs. What we believe, the value in understanding our philosophy is that if you understand how to struggle well, if you understand how to keep your mind, your body, your spirituality, your finances, which is our wellness model, if you figure out how to keep those healthy, then what you're able to do in the sine wave is basically minimize the severity of the ups and downs, which is very important, and to shorten the distance between them. And that's really what we work on in our programming is teaching people just that. How do we learn how to self-regulate so that we're not living a life that looks like this? Because this type of a life is brutal. The mental health community, and which I'm not a big fan of. I try to be as kind as I can. Sometimes it's a little hard because I've had so many terrible encounters with the system. But the mental health community for severe depression, which is down here, right? If you look at a sine wave like this, the mental health community actually came out with a diagnosis a couple of years ago called TRD, treatment-resistant depression. So now, if the doctor or the pharmaceutical can't solve your depression, they blame it on you, the patient, that you're resistant to treatment. And we don't believe that. We believe that everybody has an opportunity to grow after trauma. And prior to writing Struggle Well, my favorite book, and I keep it on my desk. I didn't do this for the podcast. I've probably read this thing 20 times. It's tabbed and underlined. But it's a book by Viktor Frankl, who was a survivor of the Second World War, the concentration camp survivor, who was a psychiatrist who went into the concentration camps as a psychiatrist and probably got a little bit better treatment than the average prisoner in concentration camps, but was still badly mistreated. And Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And what Frankl suggests is that, which I think is what we all realize today, is that the important things in our lives need to be understood. And what the science of post-traumatic growth suggests is that when we are suffering with trauma, that if we take the opportunity to learn from that trauma, that we can actually go on to be a better version of ourselves because we've learned, our wisdom's increased, and now we're at a place where we can turn back around and help others through their journey. And that's really what it's all about. I'll give you a specific example, which I was thinking of the other day for some reason. But my mom died when I was 7 years old. Now, my dad remarried my stepmother, wonderful, she's still alive, and we're very close. And truthfully, if my dad wouldn't have remarried, I probably would have ended up in jail somewhere. But I got a great stepmother, I had a great father. My dad died in 2013, and man, it left a mark on me. I have seen a lot of death in my time, including in my family, like most people have. But my dad and I were very close. And I tell people I was in a funk for about 3 months. And in that 3 months, what I worked on myself was really trying to make meaning of my dad's death. Now, my dad's death is a little bit complicated. He had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma cancer. I found the best doctor in the world for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was right here in DC at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Took my dad to the doctor. My dad was 71 years old. Took my dad to the doctor, and he looked my dad right in the eyes and said, "Sir, I see the cancer in your body. I know you want it out of there, but I'm telling you, you're going to die of old age before you die of the cancer. Don't put yourself through chemo. Don't put yourself through the pain of treatment. You're going to be fine. You're never going to be in pain from this type of cancer. You know, you're never going to witness anything." All the things that you would say. Anyway, my dad, who didn't like the idea, like my mom died of cancer when she was 29, my dad didn't like the idea of having cancer inside his body, went for a second opinion to a doctor that was in his 80s, was not progressive, was not, was basically following traditional protocols, which was get you in, put a port in, pump chemotherapy through your body. Anyway, my dad ended up getting something called Chemo Brain, which is in fact a disease. Primarily, it was seen in HIV patients, but it's a virus that we all carry in our body. But if your immune system is compromised, severely compromised, this virus can take over your body, and within 3 months, it'll kill you. It starts off looking like a stroke. It starts to eat your brain, and it looks like a very early onset of dementia, followed by Alzheimer's, followed by death. And the doctors at UVA walked us through the process. Your dad's got 3 months to live, and here's what's going to happen. And it was almost to the week of what these doctors said. And by the way, it happens in 1 in a million people. So, you hear the story, and like all this stuff's going through your head. And I'm angry with my dad for taking the chemo, and now he's left our family probably 20 years too early. What's going on? And the reason I tell you the story is because that story and me making the meaning of that story helped me to heal through the process. And yes, it took me 3 months, but for somebody as close to me as that could be, and even now, I mean, I'm choked up a little bit just talking about it, but the past we can't change, but once I made meaning of it, then I knew there were other things that I can do. And like today, my assistant's 24-year-old daughter is going through breast cancer. And I'm like, let's help. We're going to get you as many opinions as you guys want. She's 24 years old. She's not 65. She's not menopause. I mean, let's make sure we get the most progressive treatments that everybody's comfortable with. And those are the things that you can do when you make meaning of trauma. And that's just one thing. I mean, I could give you a lot of other experiences, but that's what I hope people can do is to really understand that there are these lessons to be learned from these traumatic experiences. None of them are healthy, and that once we understand those meanings and we make meaning of it, then we can go on to really live a much better life through that trauma. So. That's really the story of post-traumatic growth, and it's one that I firmly believe in. And you mentioned Charlie Plum right in the foreword to our book. Charlie spent 6 years, almost to the day, in prison camps in Vietnam. He was tortured, starving, beaten, molested, sores on his body. He said he had boils on his face so bad he couldn't see out of his eyes. The mental health community told the families of the Vietnam prisoners of war to be prepared to institutionalize them for life. And the complete opposite occurred. If you didn't know Charlie Plum's story and you met Charlie Plum, you would think he's the most positive person in the world. I mean, it's just amazing how you can go through that experience, forgive, not forget, but forgive, to be grateful for what you have, and to go on to share your story and hopes of helping other people's. And that's what Charlie Plum and all the prisoners of war who came back from Vietnam, because the opposite occurred. Mental health community said be prepared to institutionalize them. The men came back, and man for man, when you look at a prisoner of war from Vietnam and one of their peers, let's say two pilots, one that spent 6 years in a concentration camp and one that flew the same number of combat missions over Vietnam but was never shot down, the health of the prisoners of war, both mentally and physically, man for man, is better with the prisoner of war population. And they've been studying these men since 1974. So it's amazing to me how bad we miss the true science of psychology and sociology and human nature. And that's what what I work on every day, is to try to come up with a better way of triaging people who are dealing with depression and anxiety.
So you mentioned about that story with Charlie, and you talk about it in your book. What made the difference for him? And I want to roll this into the question of why do some people get stuck on it? You're mentioning about making meaning, but there's some different aspects that you talk about in your book, and Charlie hit on one of those things, where what he did while he was in the concentration camp, the prisoner of war camp, and that led to his being able to, and for others to be able to actually survive and come out and be healthy and positive and so forth. So can you talk about that whole idea of shame, I think,
Yeah.
because it's kind of like that Brene Brown is talking about it, of course. So the last number of years has really been incredible, the work that she's been putting out there, the research and so forth. But yet talking about that shame and how it really holds us in place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because Brene Brown says something along the lines, I'll probably misquote her, but it's close enough, I think, is that shame can't withstand, excuse me, the spoken word. So if I talk about it and I'm not holding it inside, shame and guilt, then other people know about it, then I have less probably to be shameful of. And that's the concept of in the science of post-traumatic growth, we call that disclosure. And that's basically getting those things off of your chest. And with a very private group of people that you feel comfortable in sharing those types of things. So shame is a big part. In prison camps, the interesting thing that happened in those prison camps in Vietnam was the isolation, which is brutal to human nature. Humans, in general terms, humans thrive on relationships. What keeps us the happiest in life, the longest ongoing study in the world being done up at Harvard, is this study on happiness. And they've been studying this Harvard class of 1936 or 38, I think, since 1942, whenever they graduated. About walking through people's lives and what happens. On that study, it was criticized heavily in the 70s, and they went into the inner city of Boston and actually got some underprivileged children. Because as you can imagine, in 1942, you were probably a rich white guy going through Harvard University, right? So how aren't you going to be happy? You're rich, you're white, you've got this privileged kind of life, right? So they went into the inner city and they took people. But anyway, what they've learned in this study is, from everybody, is what makes people the happiest in life is in fact relationships, the best relationships. It's not the money they made, it's not the house they live in, the cars they drive, the things that we tend to chase as Americans, which we almost cause our own dilemmas sometimes. So we know that relationships are important. So now these guys are isolated, And then they figure out a way of communicating with others through tapping on the walls and pulling of wires through holes that the mice have made in these prison cells. And then they start to get reconnected, and that connection starts to bring them hope. And then the first conversation Charlie Plum has with the guy in the cell next to him, not his cellmate, but the guy in the cell next to him. Charlie says, "Well, if you knew what happened to me, you probably wouldn't want to talk to me." And the guy said, "Well, what happened to you?" And he said, "Well, I broke under torture and I told them more." So the Geneva Convention says, tell them your name, rank, and social security number. That was all you were, so your ID card number at the time. That's all you were supposed to tell. But, these guys were getting brutalized, and the Vietnamese wanted to know when the next air attacks were going to be, what kind of bombs they were going to drop, what kind of missiles they were going to shoot, how high were the planes flying, things that the Vietnamese could use to knock these planes out of the sky. And Charlie said to the guy, "You probably wouldn't want to talk to me. You'd be ashamed of me because I broke." And the guy tapped back or pulled the wire back in Charlie's case and said, "Listen, Charlie," he said, "every man in here broke. You have nothing to be ashamed about." And Charlie said that day was like the weight of the world, like lifting off of his shoulders. And that's that shame. It's like the disclosure of letting that stuff go. And it's a very, very powerful tool. And Charlie tells it much better than I could ever tell it, but I've heard it many times and I know the story well. So, here were these men, 500 men roughly that were in this prison camp that were finding ways to communicate with each other. They knew what each other had done, and they worked hard to share their stories with each other. They had a policy. They actually, the senior officer in the prison camps was a guy named James Stockdale, who's a legend, right, in the Stoic. And Stockdale told them when they came back from torture, they had a responsibility. They used to call it getting on the wall. And they would get on the wall and tap and make sure that everybody knew what they had said, what they had disclosed, and get that off of their chest. And Stockdale also said, that the prison isn't the 8-foot cell you're in, it's the 8 inches between your ears. So don't get stuck in this, there's a difference between being in a prison. I think Charlie says it, there's a difference between being in a prison and being a prisoner. And
Yes.
that's what they didn't want to be, was a prisoner. And that's what happens, aside from people who have suffered that level of trauma, which most of us will never, be exposed to. That's what my message is to everybody, is that, there are ways, regardless of the type of trauma, there are ways to get through this. And you just need a couple of really good tools in your life. And those are the things that we talk about in the book. The first one being these relationships. We call it your 3 to 5. We believe that, you become the average, as a human, you become the average of the 3 to 5 people you spend the most time with in life. You're spending time with 3 to 5 drunks, you're going to be a drunk. You're spending time with 3 to 5 drug addicts, you'll probably be a drug addict. You're spending time with 3 to 5 entrepreneurs or successful people, then you'll probably end up in that environment. And then the other thing is this ability to self-regulate. When stress does hit our body, which it will, maybe in some people's cases every day, especially now with COVID going on, it's just added to the stress that we all live in our lives anyway. Can we self-regulate? Do we have this ability, this internal control mechanism that allows us to, use our body the way it was designed? And remember, our bodies are designed to self-heal. I tell everybody all the time, if post-traumatic growth wasn't real, human nature would have been extinct with the dinosaurs. We are thrivers, and our bodies and our brains are designed to push the right chemicals through it when you need them. But you need to be able to do that, right? You need to get out and exercise. And, if you're sitting on the couch and eating and drinking and feeling sorry for yourself, that's where you're going to be. You got to get out and walk, get the dopamine flowing across your brain. Those things are what make us real. And by the way, they're much better for you than the pharmaceutical side of that. And that's what happens with a lot of people who get stuck, is that they get into this position where they're having a hard time putting the one foot in front of the other. They end up in the system, what I call the mental health system. They get, pharmaceutical solutions to their problems, and that just makes them lazier, fatter, and next thing you know, they're stuck on the couch and they can't get out let their bodies do the work for them. So there's just lots of great things that we can do, for ourselves and for our friends to prevent us from having to see therapists and from having to take the drugs that many of them prescribe.
Yeah, I think those things there's a place for them, and there's a time and place, but they're certainly overused for
Uh,
sure,
yep.
for sure. Well, when you talk about COVID, we talk isolation, disconnecting people from their relationships, the stress of uncertainty, and so forth. It's all happening right now, and that's why I wanted you to come on talk about this, because it's not just for veterans or those returning from combat um, that have experienced this, that need this. We all do, and I love what you talk about in the book, and I think it was Josh, somebody had said to him, like, "Oh, dude, that was nothing." And he said, "Well, but it was whatever his experience was in comparison to this vet." And yet it's all relative. So what trauma is for one, or what struggle, what difficulty, the experience that one person has is going to be different from the other, but it's all relative to our experience and what we the meaning we make of it, and so forth. And so uh, because there's also shame in that. There's a lot of times where people will feel like, well, I'm in a good position, and I've actually heard people say, I feel guilty about feeling stress because actually I have a pretty good life compared to someone else.
Yeah.
And so then there's like, we can make shame about pretty much anything, and so it's really helping people to get out of that pattern. Now I wanted you to talk about something that I think is really important, that even for myself, because I have experienced a lot of different trauma in my life and different experiences. And so it's funny because when COVID came along, people were saying like, "How are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm fine." I mean, I've already been trained, with all of the stuff that I've been through. I'm very resilient because I learned how to struggle well. So I was kind of maybe a little bit more equipped for it. But even with me, I noticed that were some things that trauma, for example, where I'm like, I'm over it. I've got this. I'm good. And then something happens and you get triggered and you realize you're not over it and it's still there. So how do you know? Because as I said, there's a lot of people who say, I don't need to deal with that stuff. I don't need to go back and heal that stuff. I'm way beyond that. And yet it does hold them back. So what are some telltale signs of unhealed trauma that you get to go back and look at and to heal, so that you can actually struggle well, that you can actually thrive and get beyond it?
Well, and again, it's all about that, making that meaning of what happened in the past. And humans are the sum of the training that we receive from the day that we're born until the day that we die. And I think that's one of life's biggest lessons, is that one of the goals in life is that we work on ourselves all the time to make better versions of ourselves, and to increase our wisdom, and to increase our fitness, and to increase our ability to share this story with others who are coming on the path behind us. That's the way the world was, right? I mean, if you think about the simplicity of the world, me as the father, as a caveman, my job was to protect my family, which included feeding them, clothing them, keeping the dinosaurs out of the cave, whatever it might have been. And my job as I got older was to teach, and my sons got older, was to teach them how to do that for them. So, those are the things that I believe that are really important. We, one of the bad things that happens in the world, and I'm sure all your listeners hear this, is the scientific community calls them adverse childhood experiences. Is that in those ages of development, let's say from 4 years old to 18 years old, in these really developing ages, if we undergo a lot of trauma through our family and our friends and our connections as children, that tends to stick with us for a very long time. Because normally children don't get the proper treatment for that, and that's why teenage suicide rates are high and those types of things. So it's really important, I think, to really understand, first and foremost, that everybody's carrying something. They say, I think in the world of ACE science, there's about 11 or 12 categories, things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, poverty, divorce, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, homelessness, single parenting. I mean, there's about 11 of these. I can never list them all, but that's 9 of the 11 I think I listed. And they say that the average American has one ACE score, meaning that all of us have something that happened in our childhood. But 30% of Americans have 3 or more ACE scores. Maybe you're raised in poverty and that led to drugs and divorce, or drugs and single parenting. I don't know. But, when you start to get 3 or more of these ACE scores, your life starts to get very challenging to come out of that. And unless you get this opportunity to make meaning of it and to learn from it. Now, what I will say about childhood trauma is that any trauma that happens in our past, no matter what we do, they have some treatments that tell you that they can teach you how to forget what happened to you, but the truth is you'll never forget it, right? And we are firm believers that it's okay to reflect on the past, because what we want to do as we get smarter and we get through this journey is to continue to go back and make meaning of it. Why did that happen? And what did I do? So I had, as you read probably in the book, I had a abusive grandfather who was an alcoholic. And, in my mind, it was like, okay, I don't want to be like my grandfather. And that's normally what happens, right? You kind of get one or the other. It's like, I am there that I'm going to go that route because I had some level of respect for the man and he seemed to have a good life and he drank a lot and I like to drink a lot and I'm going to go that route. Or it's like, wow, I didn't really like that man and I'm going to stay away from, what made him poisonous. And that's choice. That's that fork in the road, right? That we all have. And that's the one thing that's very common in humanity is that we all have choice. And those are decisions that we actually have to make on which way, if we go after them. So I think it's important to know that I always tell people that life is about living in the present, being here today with you, being here today with your audience, but being here with myself and making sure that I'm present for this conversation, that we're listening to each other and talking. It's okay to reflect on the past. You just can't get stuck there and you can't live there. And then to really plan and set goals for a productive future. And that every morning when I get up, I do a self-inventory, right? We know one thing we know about successful people is that they are very self-aware. So we get up in the morning and we do this inventory. How are we doing from head to toe? How's my wellness? As I mentioned, our wellness model is mind, body, finances, and spirituality. How is our wellness in those 4 areas? And then what are we doing to help somebody else through their challenges? And what are we doing in these short-term goals to be productive and move forward in our lives? And that's really what life's all about. But when you get stuck in the past, it's brutal. I mean, it's no matter how many conversations you have with people, it's brutal. But once you let that off your chest and people start to understand why you are who you are, and you get that shame off your chest, it becomes, it's almost like letting you out of the cage.
Yeah, it reminds me of, and that's why I love what you're doing, and I love the approach that you're taking to this, because I remember somebody at one point who was like full blown in victim mode, and it's just as an observation, we were talking about something, and she said, I'm like, I don't live in a victim mode, and I'm glad I don't look at, but she was talking about it from a victim place. And I think sometimes when you talk about self-awareness is being aware of what's going on. You talk about presence is if you can't be present, or sometimes it's like that delusion. There was a book out there, was it Leadership and the Art of Self-Deception or something like that? I forget. Arbiter Institute put it out. Great, great book. And it's really, I guess where I'm getting at is like really knowing and listening to yourself and recognizing and recognizing where you're at, not from a judgment, not from a shame perspective, but to look at it from this perspective of an opportunity to heal. Because as I was reading your book, and I've done a lot of personal development work, and even recently done a lot of personal development work because of some of the things that have happened over the last number of few years. And even as I read your book and I was going through and I was like, wow, I never thought of that as an eighth. I never thought of it that like that.
Right.
And not that I was trying to make meaning of something that wasn't there, but it was something that was there. And I saw how that was impacting my life in it. So it's like layers, like you said, you're all constantly growing and so forth. And even just from reading your book and going through some of the exercises you had, um, I felt a lift. I felt my energy pop up. And like I said, I've done a ton of personal development work. I coach people for a living. I'm in transformational work. But even then it was like, wow, that's really, I never really noticed that. It was like lurking down below. And it's so, so powerful. So if we could take the shame away from and the judgment away from having to do the work on yourself, and the I'm fine, everything's good, everything's good, you're good, I'm good, everything's good, and we're not, but we pretend to be good just to think like that's what society wants to see. um it opens up the possibility for us to be real. I know Josh talked about in his book at one point. He said to somebody, he said, I just got to say, I'm not okay. And they said, no, you're not, but you will be,
Yeah.
and you'll get through it. And so there's power and there's freedom in that. So, Ken, thank you so much for putting the time into this book. I know that you've got a lot going on, and you've got a family, and we can hear it in the background. You got a family, and a lot of things going on. But to take this time to write this book, which was quite an in-depth process, I'm sure. I really appreciate it, so that not only can veterans get the benefit of your work, but also uh, the veterans of life, can get the benefit of your work. So I really appreciate that. And for our listeners, I would encourage you, go get a copy of this book, Struggle Well, Thriving in the Aftermath of Trauma. And you can go to strugglewell.com is their website. We'll, of course, have that on our website as well in the show notes, leaderstransformation.com. But I highly recommend getting a copy of this book, even if, and that's where when I was alluding to is like sometimes people think we've got this. Even if you think I got this, I've dealt with my stuff, I've moved on, it's still worth a read. You might be able to help somebody else through the information that you learn, but you might be surprised, like myself, where there may be some further layers that you can heal and to continue to help you in a different perspective on struggle, and that will help you to move forward in that much faster and that much more richly, if you will. So with that, Ken, any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
Just for everybody that's listening, I mean, just know that this stuff is normal. Right? Struggle is normal. What we struggle with is what makes it, I think, individual. And don't compare your woes. I mean, it's the book is very clear. As Josh, Josh's and my struggles are much different. Some people look at Josh and say, well, those aren't really struggles. That's what everybody goes through. But that's our point, is that everybody goes through this stuff. And maybe not everybody went through what I went through, and it's different. But we all we all know that it's normal, and that if you do the right things and get the right people around you, you can get through any challenge.
Absolutely. Ken, thank you again so much. We appreciate you for being here today and sharing what you're up to. And for our listeners, I believe that leaders of transformation take action. So again, go get a copy of their book. Go to strugglewell.com. And if you like this, please leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast listening platform. But also, I encourage you to share this with someone else. There's a lot of people right now that are experiencing trauma and are looking at healing from the trauma, even of just simply of the last 12 months through the pandemic. And so share this with them, and hopefully it can encourage them to be able to move beyond it and to learn how to struggle well. So we look forward to hearing your stories, how this is impacting you. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Leaders of Transformation real soon.